Good afternoon. I am Gregory Washington, the president of Virtual, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Russia's war on Ukraine in a historical perspective. Our Russian and Eurasian Studies program developed this 12-part series as part of a course Mason faculty are teaching on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The goal of this series is to present the work of 12 scholars and writers from around the world. Their insights help us to understand the historical relationship between Russia and Ukraine, the invasion itself, and the remarkable resistance of the Ukrainian people. Through the perspective of these historians, we are better able to comprehend the war in Ukraine in a broader context. This series is an illustration of how humanities research in a public research university can create knowledge, spur discussion, and expand understanding of complex global issues. We appreciate your viewership of this series, and we are proud that George Mason University can bring it to you. Enjoy.
Well, thank you for the last time to President Gregory Washington. It's definitely been moments like this through a series like this that I've come more than ever to appreciate the role that public research universities can play, not only in our teaching and our research, both obviously critical missions, but also in bringing that knowledge to a larger community and in fostering conversations like this one. So I'm Professor Steve Barnes from the Department of History and Director of the Program in Russian and Eurasian Studies here at George Mason University. Along with our speaker of the day, we have with us Jessica Dotrieve, who's a PhD candidate in U.S. history here at Mason and who has been my TA and my helper throughout this course in this series. Today is the last event in our series. I'm pleased to report that as of 1 week ago, we'd reached almost 4,000 viewers attending our live events and another 9,500 viewers of recordings on YouTube. I want to thank all of you who have joined us over these last 12 weeks and invite those of you who have missed any of our events to check out the recordings on our YouTube page, which Jessica will share in the chat. It's clear to me that this cannot be the end of our conversations, and so we will certainly be hosting more discussions next semester. And I promise that I'll be in touch with you to let you know what we have planned. Please also keep an eye on the events calendar for the program in Russian and Eurasian Studies, where all of the events will appear. And you can follow me on Twitter, where I post information on upcoming events as well. Although the series ends today, we're not actually quite done for the semester. Tomorrow, November 29th at 3 p.m., we will host an art historian, Svetlana Shields, who used to teach here at Mason, and she'll give a talk called "Can Ukrainian Art Explain Why Russia Launched the War Against Ukraine?" That'll also be online, and you can register at the link that Jessica will be sharing with you. Furthermore, Cynthia Hooper of the College of the Holy Cross and I will continue our Friday Q&A sessions with 2 more events before we take a bit of a break for the holidays. So please join us on Fridays, December 2nd and December 9th at 3 p.m. for a greater opportunity for back and forth and for your input as we discuss the consequences of this war for the world. We are hoping to have a China expert join us this Friday, something that would be particularly interesting given the widespread protests that have happened over the last few days, but we're waiting for a confirmation on that guest. So welcome today for the last time to my class, History 388, Russia's War on Ukraine in Historical Perspective. Though for my students, I'll remind you, don't forget that we will meet together, just us, one last time on Wednesday. Welcome also to this series that was made possible through the support of the Program in Russian and Eurasian Studies, the Department of History and Art History, the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, all parts of our George Mason University community. A special shout out, by the way, to Jennifer DeSano from Ollie and Ann Reynolds from Chess here at Mason, who were key in getting so many of you to join us all this semester. We come to you after a rough week in Ukraine, in which many people in many cities were without power for extended periods of time, just as the weather is turning decidedly toward the winter. we must continue to support Ukrainians. In the United States, we must make sure our new Congress knows that we will not stand for any reduction or delay in our support for their victory. And for everyone, please, if you haven't yet made a donation, and if you have enjoyed this series, please, if you're able, do me the favor of saying thanks by going to Razum for Ukraine to support this organization that provides humanitarian assistance and support on the ground in Ukraine. Now on to our speaker. I couldn't be more excited to welcome Anne Applebaum. We met now way too many years ago when Anne was working on her Pulitzer Prize winning book, Gulag, A History. I was a graduate student at the time at Stanford, just starting my own research on the Gulag, and Anne was out at the Hoover Institution archives doing research. The book she produced not only won the Pulitzer, but it played a critical role in bringing the important subject of the Gulag's history back to the public eye in a way it had not been in the United States since the publication of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago in the 1970s. Anne has gone on to play that important role through her books on a variety of other important subjects, a book on communist takeovers of post-World War II Eastern Europe, and a book on the Holodomor, the 1932-33 terror famine in Ukraine. Her newest book is Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, continuing her long history of focusing on and speaking out against authoritarianism. We'll put a link in the chat to her website where you can learn more about all of her books. Of course, Anne is also a staff writer for The Atlantic and has written for countless other publications in the past. No doubt that's where many of you most know her work. And her writing on Russia's war on Ukraine since February and even before has been absolutely superb. Welcome then to Anne Applebaum. We will conduct today's session a bit differently. Anne and I are going to have a conversation, but one in which we hope you'll take part by submitting your questions through the Zoom Q&A function. While I'm sure I won't be able to get to all of your questions, I will try to ask as many as I can, while also, of course, asking questions of my own and those submitted by my history students in advance. So all of that out of the way, Anne, I'm so pleased that you're here with us. Thank you for coming.
Great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
I know you met in April with President Zelensky. I can't promise I'm going to be as good a conversationalist, but I'm happy that you're willing to talk to me also. I want to start with this. Right at the outset of the full-scale invasion in February, you wrote a piece in The Atlantic called Calamity Again, and you wrote there quite extensively on the history of Ukraine. Why, at a moment when so many were intent on evaluating Putin's speeches and trying to divine Russia's intentions, why, at a moment when so many seemed to expect that Ukraine would only hold up to Russian invasion for a few days, why did you in that moment turn to history as a way to help you and to help others understand what was happening?
That's a great question, Steve, and it's one, it's one I posed to myself in a way. In the run-up to the war, I was in Washington, and I was also in Munich at the Munich Security Conference, which you might remember was about 3 days before the invasion. And I was talking to a lot of people about the invasion, a lot of experts that, Washington is actually full of people who read Russian military doctrine, who follow the status of the Russian army, who can tell you how many tanks they have and how many missiles they have, and can talk to you, with great erudition actually about Russian strategy. But there aren't that many people who know about Ukraine. And there are a few. I don't want to say they don't exist. There are some at the State Department. There's some in academia and so on. But the idea that you should study how the Ukrainians think and how the Ukrainians are planning to respond to the war and how they're talking about the invasion was surprisingly ignored. I'm not a military expert. I can't tell you how many tanks Russia has or even how many tanks Ukraine has, but I was pretty sure that the Ukrainians were going to fight back and that it was going to be much more difficult for the Russians to invade than almost everybody thought. And remember, the absolute consensus in Moscow, in Washington, in Paris, in Berlin, in London was that the war was going to be over in a few days. Maybe Kiev would be conquered immediately, and maybe it would take a few more weeks to conquer the whole country. I felt, I didn't have the numbers to back me up, but I thought the Ukrainians were going to fight back. And that article was an explanation of why. And it's an explanation of how the Ukrainians see themselves and how they remember their own history. And their history really is one of striving to become a nation and to be recognized as a modern state. Certainly, this is, of course, history of the last 200 years, and of failing several times. In the 19th century, the Ukrainians, much like, I should say, the Germans of the era or the Italians of that era, that was also a time when there was no state called Italy or a state called Germany as we know it. There were small, duchies and kingdoms, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire that ruled parts of what we now consider to be modern Europe. At that period, the Ukrainians weren't that different in a certain sense from other Europeans. They were beginning to organize around their linguistic identity, around a cultural identity.
Right.
To be Ukrainian, it's important to say, in that era, had a kind of, it wasn't just a national statement, it was almost a class statement. The Ukrainians were not part of the Russian imperial aristocracy, or they decided not to be, because of course there were Ukrainians who were integrated into the Tsarist system. But there were some intellectuals, some from the countryside, who adopted a different identity and who had a different idea of who they were and where they came from. And they consciously rejected Tsarist Russia, which I should say at that time occupied most of what is now modern Ukraine. A little bit of Western Ukraine was occupied by Austro-Hungary. But they had a different idea of who they were. They traced their history back in a different way, to a different lineage, and they began to make those arguments.
Mm-hmm.
That movement, that Ukrainian national movement, which, as I say, was very similar to what you would have seen in Poland and Italy and lots of other parts of Europe at that time, was quite brutally crushed by the Tsarist regime. So Ukrainian theaters were banned, Ukrainian newspapers were banned. Ukrainian couldn't be a language used in schools or in the civil service. But that experience, that first organizing experience, left a mark. People remembered it. And when it became clear that the Tsarist Empire was going to fall apart in 1917, the Ukrainians took that opportunity to try again, as the Poles, as the Balts, as other modern European states at that time. They again tried to become a modern state. All through 1918, 1919, there was an enormous civil war all across southern Russia and Ukraine, and the Ukrainians lost. They lost to the Bolsheviks. They lost partly because the Tsarist armies wouldn't recognize them and wouldn't fight alongside them. They lost, and they failed to establish a state. But they did establish a kind of Soviet republic inside the Soviet Union, which was Lenin and Trotsky's way of granting to them some kind of identity. They understood after the 1918 Civil War that Ukraine was a real place. It needed some kind of identity. This was their way of trying to deal with that. My article it tried to evoke those moments when Ukraine tried to become a state and failed. And it was a reminder that, the Ukrainians know that history, and they know that the forces seeking to deprive them of that recognition are just as alive today as they were then.
Fantastic. Let me follow up on that a little bit. So you also wrote in that essay you wrote, there are no simple lines to be drawn between the past and the present. There are no direct analogies. No nation is forced to repeat its past, but the experiences of our parents and grandparents, the habits and lessons they taught us, do shape the way we see the world. And I was wondering if you could just expand a little bit on that thinking for us, on how you understand the tie between the past and the present. You're writing obviously often for audiences that are trying to understand our present moment. How is it that you understand that tie between the past and the present in your own writing?
It's complicated and nuanced. I very much dislike the shallow school of thought that says because country X has always been that way, that means it will always continue being that way. This is, of course, almost always how Russia is described and defined.
Totally agree. Yeah.
Russia has been like this for so many years. You can't possibly imagine that it could be different. I mean, I could point you around the world to dozens, hundreds of countries that are different and became different because they had a different kind of political leadership. Our own country, the United States, has become very different from what it once was, thanks to social movements, political leaders, thought leaders pushing the country in different directions. It's not an accident that we don't have slavery anymore. There's a reason for it, because people wanted to change that in our country, and they did it. And the same can be true of Russia, and of course the same can be true of Ukraine. And I think it's, in the context of Ukraine, it's very important to understand that the Ukrainians have a very active sense, almost too much of a sense actually, but they have a very active sense that they created their modern state. They recreated their national movement, which had been totally crushed, first by the czars, then by Stalin, then by 70 years of Soviet occupation. They recreated it in 1991. They held a national referendum. They declared independence from the Soviet Union. That's one of the reasons why the Soviet Union broke up, maybe even the main reason. They did it again, so 91, again in 2005, when they perceived that there was a kind of Russian-backed plot to turn Ukraine into a kind of corrupt client state of Russia. They did it again in 2014 in very similar circumstances. So they had this experience of having made changes to their country. And Ukraine, even on the eve of the war in February of 2022, was already a different place than what it was in 2014. And that was because of the active involvement of Ukrainians in their state, in changing the way the army worked, in changing the way the media worked, in changing the way the government worked, in lobbying for anti-corruption laws, in pushing the country in, as they would say, European direction. So the Ukrainians have this sense of agency that is derived from the past in some ways. They remember both the recent past and the distant past that makes them think they can achieve change. But it's also powered in some by their own personal experience. So, the past can be used in different ways. I mean, the past can be seen as this, sort of almost oppressive, inalterable, deterministic set of factors that mean nothing can happen. Or the past can be seen as something inspiring that can make you want to participate in public life and change your country. And so it's very important, not just that we remember the past. I mean, that's a very banal thing to say,
right,
but it's about how we remember it and what we do with those memories and how we apply them to the present that really makes the difference between one nation and another.
When you're writing, so one of my students this week, Joey Hart, asked, wanting to know a little bit more about sort of your goal in using history in writing for sort of more journalistic publications. Is your goal to provide the reader with context for current events? Is it a way to explain the origins of current events? He was just curious in that kind of writing, sort of how you think about how you use history.
So I have to assume that most people reading my articles, I mean, there's obviously an important section of whom that's not true, but most of them don't know the history of Ukraine. Right. It's not something we studied in school. I didn't study it in school. I didn't even study it at university. I most of what I know about Ukraine, I learned long after graduation. So most people don't know it. And for me, in order to explain why things are happening the way they are now, what motivates the Ukrainians, why are they defending their country, why is Russia attacking their country? In order to explain why those things are happening, I feel you do need a little bit of history. And I very often use it. I put it in articles, not just about Ukraine, but about other things, because I think, if you have some context, it'll help you explain current events. I mean, too much of the time, news coverage just focused on what happened yesterday.
Right.
And if that's all then it's insufficient. I mean, it's not explaining people's motivations, and it doesn't help, understand what's going on. I mean, I don't think that history can be used to predict the future. Just because something happened one way in the past doesn't mean that it will happen that way in the future. but you should know what it is that people have in their heads. You know, what is it that people are operating from? You know, maybe Steve, you've had this experience as well. It was only later in my life that I realized how much of how I see the world is shaped by my experience of historical events, and how that already separates me from people who are 20 or 30 years younger, who don't remember things the same way that I do. You know, I have a kind of very clear, for example, I mean, it's the most obvious example. I have a very clear memory of the collapse of communism, you know, what that looked like, why it happened, who were the players. And of course, people who are 30 years younger than me, who I also do some teaching, and so I meet them in my classes, they don't have that memory. And that already shapes the way that we see the world. And so I think it's important for people to know what it is that people have in their heads, what's motivating them, what they remember, and why that's making them act the way they do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's always been, I think, very much forefront for me, precisely because of what you were talking about. So I started college in the fall of 1989. I sat there and watched on the news as people danced on top of the Berlin Wall. And there's no way in the world that I would be a professor of Russian and Soviet history if that hadn't happened, because that's what got me interested in all of this.
I was in Berlin in 1989, and I'm not sure I was dancing on the wall, but I was sitting on it. So somewhere I have some little asbestos chips, you know, from the wall. They're floating around in my desk drawer. So,
one of my students, just sort of on this question, wanted to know how it is that you got interested in writing about history, and in particular, how you got interested in this part of the world.
I mean, it's a little bit, I always say, people always ask me that question as if it were some kind of bizarre, you know, why, particularly Poles, by the way, I lived part of the time in Poland. Why are you interested in us? You know, and I'm sometimes my answer is, you know, some people are interested in Chinese art. Some people are interested in butterflies. You know, some people are interested in earthworms. You know, that's what I'm interested in. So it's not as weird as all that. But I think for me, there was a sort of path in that was something to do with the novels I read in high school. I was a great reader of Russian fiction. I read a lot of Nabokov, who's who I still turn to now and again to try and understand his Russia, which he wrote beautifully about in his memoir. I just quoted him literally in something I wrote a few weeks ago. Partly it was because I was in college in the 1980s. I'm a tiny bit older than you. And this was the era of the so-called Second Cold War. Ronald Reagan was the president. There was a lot of talk about Russia. And it was, I was literally drawn to this, this idea of there being a mirror civilization. What was it? How did it work? I studied Russian in college, and I was lucky, I now realize, I was lucky enough to spend a summer in Leningrad when it was still Leningrad. It was still the Soviet Union. So, and I reckon I must be one of the last kind of generation of American students who got to do that, because even a couple of years later, it wasn't, after Gorbachev came to power, it wasn't quite the same. So I saw the Soviet system when it was still very much, it was still very much Brezhnev's Soviet Union, although he wasn't the party leader then, but it still felt like that. And that, that experience, and really the attempt to understand what that was and how it worked, and then how it fell apart, has been driving me ever since. I mean, the first journalism I did was really about how it was falling apart. I was a freelance journalist in Poland in 1988 and 89, and then actually up to 91, 92. Later, a lot of my books were about how did it come together in the first place. So what did the Soviet conquest of Eastern Europe look like? How did they put the Soviet Empire together? That was one of my books. As you noted, another one was about the Gulag, which was the central piece of repression in the system. And then my third history book was about Ukraine. It was an attempt to understand what was the Ukrainian famine, how it fit into that story of repression and totalitarianism, how it was different from the broader Soviet famine, what was special about it, how did it work? And of course, in the course of doing that, I learned a lot of Ukrainian history.
Oh, fantastic!
Which made me, it was one of those things where, I have to tell you, Ukraine in 2012 or 13, when I started to work on the book, seemed fairly obscure. I mean, wasn't a mainstream subject, but obviously it turned out to be a worthwhile investment of time. But I'll say one other thing about journalism. It's given me this sense of almost obligation. I feel like I have to talk about Ukraine and talk about Ukrainian history. And then I have this obligation to explain it to people because so few people know about it. I mean, more know about it now than they once did. But it's almost like once you know about it, there's some kind of, you feel like you need to do it. So part of what's kept me going was this feeling that I had some windows, I had some understanding of that part of the world, and I owed it to the people there to explain it, in English.
Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing some of your personal story. Obviously, a lot of my students are at a moment in their lives where they're trying to figure out what their path is going to be. And so they're always interested in these kinds of questions. And let me actually follow that up with one that we have here in our Q&A, but it actually is from one of my students, Paul Abushan, who just said, what advice would you have for someone interested in a career in reporting on Russia and Eastern Europe?
And the main advice, I give people two kinds of advice. One of them is to learn a weird language, learn a language that nobody else speaks. And then you have access to other cultures. I learned first Russian and then Polish. And that's, both of those, Polish in particular was considered a kind of, exotic thing to study. But actually, once you know Polish, it gives you access to all kinds of places, including Western Ukraine. So I would say that as a piece of advice. And I would also say, make sure that you do something that you care about. You're going to be much better at whatever subject it is that you choose to write about or choose to focus on. Make sure that you care about it and become the expert in that subject, however narrow it is. Because there's always a need for people who know things. And so really burrowing into something, going into great detail, going to somewhere difficult to live, following what's happening there, making friends there, that will give you the insight that you need to be able to talk more broadly about the world. Don't start from 1,000 feet and write about geopolitics. Start lower. I mean, this is my advice. Start much lower than that and learn about the politics of Kazakhstan, and then you'll know something that nobody else knows.
Right. Fantastic. Let me circle back around now to get back to sort of more discussion of history, and so you were talking about how you try to maintain a sort of complex and nuanced understanding of the relationship between the past and the present. You talked about how you don't like sort of notions that a country is this way because it's always been this way and it will always be that way. And then you talked a good bit about Ukraine and Ukrainian history. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on how you think about this with respect to Russia. And I know you said that you don't like this presentation that Russia is always and will always be. But how do you use history in terms of trying to present Russia in talking about this war?
So the use of history in talking about this war was begun by Putin himself. Putin himself has a very peculiar and particular understanding of history and of his own role in it, and has sought to impose that role on the whole region. So he essentially has a vision of Russia as a kind of leading, important sovereign state. And he doesn't think of the countries around Russia, Russia's neighbors, and I would include, by the way, not just Ukraine, but Poland, the Baltic states, essentially all the smaller countries between Russia and Germany. He doesn't think they have sovereignty or that they have a right to sovereignty. And he bases that assumption on his understanding of Russian imperial history and of Soviet history. So he does very much see the past as somehow determining the present, right. And he wants to bring back some elements of the past to the present. And once you understand that, you understand a part of his invasion of Ukraine. I should say that it's not the only explanation. Another piece of the story is that Putin runs a very particular kind of modern autocratic kleptocracy. So he is not only the ruler of Russia, he's also the owner of a lot of Russia, Russian companies, Russian money. And he, together with the people around him, are, again, they both run the country and they own it. They're the people who work for the presidential administration, and they simultaneously are on the board of Gazprom, or one of the Russian state companies. They control the wealth of the country as well as the politics of the country. And so their personal well-being and their personal fortunes and the fortunes of their friends and family depend upon them staying in power in a way that can be hard for, I think, people in Western societies to understand. We have this assumptions about certain kinds of separations of power. I mean, sure, there's big business has influence over government in America. I'm not going to deny that, but that's not to say, the chairman of Exxon and the president of the United States are not the same person. They don't have exactly the same interests. They have some divergent interests. Even when the former chairman of Exxon becomes Secretary of State, he then acquires different interests. So as has happened, in recent memory. In Russia, they don't have those kinds of separations. And so for Putin, part of staying in power and part of keeping his personal wealth means that he has to continue to defend the Russian political system. What are the threats to that system? And again, he looks to history in order to understand what the threats of. He imagines the threats to be some kind of popular rebellion. Unlikely though that might seem, and impossible though that feels right now in Russia, where there doesn't seem to be much rebellion at all. Although, I mean, that's a little bit deceptive, but most of the people who would be rebels have now left the country. But what does he remember? He remembers 1917. He remembers 1991. He remembers the Orange Revolution and the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine. Those kind of street demonstrations that turn into political change are what he's most afraid of. And I should say, sorry, I left an important one out. In 1989, when you were watching, the Berlin Wall fall on television, Putin was a KGB officer in East Berlin, in Dresden, but in East Germany. And he experienced that event from a completely different perspective. In other words, he saw it as a disaster and a tragedy. And he's said so several times in different ways. So for him, and that was also, he saw the weekly demonstrations as they were in Germany. He saw, the mob come to the wall. He was inside the KGB headquarters in Dresden when it was surrounded by protesters. He and his colleagues were burning papers in the courtyard, or so he says, so he claims to remember. For him, this specter of disorder, demonstration and disorder leading to the toppling of the regime is something he has at the front of his mind too. And this comes from both his personal experience and from history. And so what he sees in Ukraine is something incredibly dangerous. So he sees a country where there has been a successful or partially successful democratic transition, where Ukraine, that was a part of this Russian empire in the past, and which he attempted to make part of the kind of Russian kleptocratic system in the present, has successfully broken away and is seeking to become a democracy and to become European. And the Ukrainians themselves understand it that way. That's why they waved European flags at their demonstrations in 2014, and why you see so much talk about Europe and the EU in Ukraine now. They understand Europe very much as a kind of civilizational change. They want to be part of a civilization that is based on democracy, on the rule of law, on separation of powers, that's different from the autocratic world that Putin lives in. And Putin, of course, sees this as well. And he sees, I think genuinely sees Ukraine as a kind of, both as a historical part of this empire he believes should be brought back into existence, but also as a kind of ideological challenge to him. So Ukraine is by its nature a problem for Putin and for Putinism. It's also the case that if the Ukrainians can break off, the Ukrainians who do have a lot of cultural similarity with Russia and who do have several centuries of coexistence with Russia and who are intermarried with Russians and who share culture with them, if they can become different, if they can become a democracy, if they can integrate into Europe, then a lot of Russians might say, well, then why can't we? And of course, this is the argument that Putin wants to head off. So as you see, you can see a lot of different historical strands of what's going on. Putin's memory of old Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire, also his knowledge, his experience of revolutionary transitions, and his sense that Ukraine is going in a different direction, and that it's his obligation to stop it now. And I think that's the true origin of this war.
So let me ask you one more kind of general question, and then I want to actually turn to some of your work on some of your books for a bit. But I'm wondering, in thinking about all of this and sort of your understanding of history as complex and nuanced, and how can, or I don't know, maybe the question is, can historians maintain a sense of the complexities of history to avoid oversimplifying, to avoid, maybe painting blacks and whites where there are really shades of grays? How can historians maintain that complex and honest approach to history when that history is playing an important role in the midst of the demands of a moment of ethical absolutes, right? I mean, there is an absolute need to support Ukraine in this war. We see history being misused by political elites. So it's easy, right? It's easy, morally speaking, to correct Putin's ugly and intentionally distorted views of history. But doesn't it sort of prove sometimes less easy when a Ukrainian wants to oversimplify what was perhaps a complicated issue in their own past, maybe around something like the history of World War II, in an effort to unify their people against the Russian invader here? Just wondering sort of your sense of how you maintain that complexity as a historian in a moment like this.
I mean, it depends what the context is. I mean, I very much do think historians can be nuanced and complex, and that, you can present multiple sides of the same story. I mean, so I wrote a book about the Ukrainian famine, but it's not a book that says, evil Russians created the famine and Ukrainians died. I mean, it's a more complicated story than that. So there were Ukrainians who were involved in carrying out the famine, not just the Ukrainian Communist Party, but ordinary Ukrainians who became part of these activist groups who went village to village and took people's food away.
Right.
I did write about that, and the book has been very widely accepted in Ukraine. It's translated. I think Ukrainians can understand the complexity of their own history too. And I think I would separate, the writing of that history from, the polemics around the war. I mean, you can, those are sort of two separate conversations, and you have to think of them like that. But I actually, given the nature of this war, I don't think the Ukrainians, or anybody who supports them, needs to simplify their history. I mean, I don't feel any need to say that every Ukrainian of all time was always a nice person, or all Ukrainians, since going back to the year 900, have been ideal people. I actually think it helps the cause of Ukraine to be nuanced about its history, and to say that, what we're seeing now is a generation of Ukrainians who want to change their country and make it better. And many of them know perfectly well the darker sides of the Ukrainian past. So I don't think oversimplification helps anyone. I mean, it can be hard in the context of a blistering political argument, to keep all the nuances straight.
Right.
And, I think we understand that, but I don't see why historians have to compromise at all in their attempt to understand and interpret the past.
So you brought up your book. So your book, Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine. And I want to talk to you just a little bit more about it. Obviously, we're seeing a different war on Ukraine here in this moment. But I wonder if you could, first off, tell people just a little bit more about the Holodomor, because I suspect a lot of people in our audience don't know a lot about it, but also how it helps you understand this war on Ukraine. And let me ask you a question. So I received a question earlier this semester from a man named Jeffrey Milstein, who has been at all of these events that I've been doing on Fridays, on Mondays. And he wrote to me this email, and I demurred. I said, look, I've got Ann Applebaum coming. She's written a whole book about this. Let me ask her. So he wrote to me and he asked this. He said, is the Holodomor a model for what Putin and his regime are consciously planning and executing against Ukraine to bring it under Russian control? He also asked then if the effort to bring cold and hunger to Ukrainians to relentlessly bomb cities and civilian populations, is that in fact an effort to bring Ukraine under Russian control, or is it, as he wrote, a matter of just punishing the Ukrainians for having resisted the Russian invasion? So I know it's a lot here, but if you could talk a little bit about the Holodomor and your book and how that's helped you to understand this, and then whether this is some kind of model as you see it for the way Putin is prosecuting this war.
Okay, so I'll give you a longish answer if that's okay.
Sure, go ahead.
So let me go back a little bit in history and explain where the famine came from. And I'll do it, briefly as I can. As I said, in 1918, there was a terrible civil war in Ukraine. There were different sides fighting, the so-called White Russians, this is the Tsarist armies, and the Bolsheviks and the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians where there were different versions of the Ukrainians fighting in different times, different armies. But it was a very bloody war. And it also was the one moment during the Civil War, there was a moment when the rebellion and the fighting was so intense in Ukraine that the Bolsheviks actually began to lose. And there was a moment in 1918 when Stalin, who was in Ukraine at that time, feared that the White armies, the Tsarist armies, would march to Moscow and the revolution might fail. And it was a kind of, the fear of Ukraine and of unrest in Ukraine was something that all the Bolsheviks remembered. They discussed it at the time. They talked about not wanting to repeat that. As I said, it was one of the reasons why they created a Ukrainian republic inside the Soviet Union, so that there would be a kind of, some kind of Ukrainian nation that people could feel attached to, and the Ukrainians wouldn't revolt against the Bolshevik state. Turn the clock forward a little bit. At the end of the 1920s, Stalin, for a variety of reasons, decides that he needs to accelerate the Bolshevik revolution, that changes aren't happening fast enough. It's been a decade since the revolution happened. Living standards are not improving. Something more radical needs to happen. And he begins this drive towards fast industrialization, but also towards the collectivization of agriculture. And he has a whole theory about how the collectivization of agriculture will hasten the development of the Soviet Union. Actually, of course, it has the opposite effect. What was the collectivization of agriculture? It meant that all over the Soviet Union, not just in Ukraine, activists and party leaders went from village to village, and they told the peasants they had to give up their land, give up their cows, give up their agricultural implements. Not too many of them had tractors at that point, but if they had them, they had to give up those too. Give them all to the state, and the state would then organize farming. And in many parts of the Soviet Union, there were peasant rebellions. People refused to cooperate. Sometimes they slaughtered all their animals. There were these famous women's rebellions. Sometimes the women in the village would kind of attack the visiting activists or the visiting Bolsheviks and beat them up, send them out. And in Ukraine in particular, there was a widespread series of rebellions, including some that involve the use of weapons. So after that rebellion of 1918, a lot of people put their guns in their barns. In 1928, 29, they got them out again, and they started shooting at people who wanted to take their land away. This kind of snowballed. As collectivization continued, it got worse. One of the other effects of collectivization was that people began to go hungry. Of course, this reorganization of land and of distribution systems meant that the harvest wasn't delivered, food couldn't be distributed. People began to go hungry, and it was at that moment. This is all over the Soviet Union, I should say. The phenomenon of the Soviet famine is all over the country, not just in Ukraine. But it was at that moment, in 1932, in the autumn of 1932, that Stalin makes a decision to use this moment of chaos and famine to get rid of the problem of Ukraine. And he passes, there's a series of laws that are passed, or resolutions rather, that are passed by the Politburo, aimed specifically at Ukraine. And these involve blacklisting particular Ukrainian farms and collective farms and communities, so that they can't receive any kind of goods or any kind of supplies. It involves preventing Ukrainians are not allowed to leave the Republic of Ukraine. The Republic is blockaded. Peasants are not allowed to come to the cities. And on top of that, activist teams are sent, house to house and village to village to collect food and grain. So this is not an artificial famine. It's not caused by drought or by insects or whatever. It's caused by these activist teams, collecting food in an attempt to, both to get food for the rest of the Soviet Union, but also to suppress the peasants of Ukraine and to kind of eliminate this peasant rebellion, essentially by pacifying the peasants. The peasants go hungry, especially in the regions of Ukraine where there had been a lot of rebellions, which were not historically the regions that usually experienced famine. So it's kind of the Kharkiv and Kiev areas,
Right.
Oblasts are the ones that suffered the famine the most, and not the southern part of Ukraine, which was historically subject to famine. There was another version of this. There were similar actions that were taken in other parts of the Soviet Union. There's another separate story to be told about Kazakhstan, which also had suffered a very peculiar experience of the famine. But the action in Ukraine was, in Stalin's own word, aimed at taming and calming, through elimination, the peasants of Ukraine. It did not kill all Ukrainians. That wasn't the goal. But it killed, arguably between 3 and 5 million. The numbers are very hard to calculate because not only were they not kept at the time, they were distorted in later years. Stalin actually later on doctored a census in 1937 to hide the missing people in Ukraine, because there should have been more Ukrainians than there were. But the famine, I should say, was, I describe it in my book. It's almost, I think it's the hardest book chapter I've ever written. What happens to people when they starve? Well, they become quiet. They lose the ability to move. They lose kind of moral sense. There are terrible stories of theft and murder and cannibalism. Some people were able to survive because they had links to someone, in the bureaucracy, and they could get some food. Some people were able to hide food. Some people hid food, but had it taken away by these teams who were coming to people's houses and looking for food and looking for hidden food. And you have horrible stories of whole villages where people die in their courtyards. Eventually there are teams who come in to bury them. In the aftermath of the famine, they have to bring students and other people from outside of the region to come and take in the harvest, because so many people have died. There's nobody even to bring in the harvest of 1933. So it's a really ghastly, almost untellable, awful story. And particularly in those regions, in central Ukraine and the peasant heart of Ukraine, it was remembered for many, many decades. And the story was passed down from father to son or mother to daughter. People kept the story inside their families. There were actually, towards the end of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, it became possible to interview people who were still alive, who remembered it, who'd been usually children at the time. And people remembered it quite well and were able to describe it. So it's something that stayed inside Ukrainian memory, and was a part of the conversation at the end of the 1980s and early 1990s, when Ukraine began to reform its independence movement. There's a particularly interesting moment at the time of the Chernobyl disaster. One of the great Ukrainian poets made a speech in which he explicitly compared the lies that were initially told about Chernobyl, which, if you remember, there was an explosion in the reactor, and then it was covered up for several days before Gorbachev admitted that there had been a disaster. And he explicitly compared that to the lies that were told about the famine. And he made this comment saying, talking about how dangerous it was even for the existence of the nation to lie to not tell the truth. And so telling the truth about the famine became a really important part of remembering Ukrainian history and trying to reestablish a Ukrainian state that would be able to protect its own citizens from that kind of repression. So that's a very brief version of what the Ukrainian famine was. Again, for more nuance, you can read my book.
Yeah.
But but your questioner asked, it was something very important about the present. So, there's not an exact, it's not as if Putin has in his head, the image of the famine and he wants to reenact it or anything like that. But I do think that the Russian tactic towards Ukraine is very much the same kind of thinking. First of all, it's the same in that Ukraine is a problem for Putin in the same way it was for Stalin. It's kind of, it's an ideological problem. It's a part of the so-called empire that will not conform, that wants something different, they didn't want to be Bolsheviks, and they don't want to be Russians, today. And that's something that, Moscow finds difficult and finds a kind of existential challenge. And one of the reasons why, starving or depriving Ukrainians of electricity and heat is a tactic that Putin is willing to use, is because, again, he sees the problem. It's not just, the leadership in Kiev or, some policy of Zelensky's that he dislikes. It's the nation, it's the nation of Ukraine and its existence that's the problem for Putin. And he wants the nation to cease to exist. And so, yes, I'm afraid I do think that in the back of his head, the idea that somehow or other this war should end with Ukraine ceasing to exist is still there. I can imagine him needing to stop the fight at some point, or we can talk about that in a minute, ways in which the war might end. I can see him, publicly saying that his goals have changed. He actually did that a few weeks ago when he declared these annexations of Eastern Ukraine. Of course, two of the regions that he annexed have already, one of them anyway, has already gone back to Ukraine. But I still think that his, the problem of Ukraine remains real to him. And the elimination of Ukrainians, just the mass death of Ukrainians, would solve his problem. And so, yes, in that sense, I do think he has genocidal intent. And I do think it's similar in that sense to what, to the Soviet policy in Ukraine. We just need to kill as many of them as possible. We need to weaken the nation. We need to eliminate its leadership. And then they'll be so weak, we can take them over and they'll become part of Russia. And there's some, that's a not very nuanced version of it, but I think that is the way they think.
Thank you. It's an incredibly interesting, obviously terribly frightening story. Certainly encourage everybody to read the book. It's a hard read at times, but I think it's really important. And
I'm afraid it is. Those who don't know any Ukrainian history might find the first part useful. There's a very short history of Ukraine at the very beginning that people have told me they find useful. There are other great books that tell the history of Ukraine.
Sure.
Sergei Plokhy wrote the great, modern history of Ukraine, which I also recommend everybody read.
Yeah, we were lucky enough to have him as part of our series earlier this semester, and he's fantastic. Right. So let me turn back actually in a different direction. So you, among the articles that you suggested that my students read was your interview with Volodymyr Zelensky. And my students were, of course, very interested, wanting to know more. And so let me just sort of put one very simply to you, and then I've got a couple of other questions kind of coming out of that interview. My student Natalia Tawid simply wants to know more about your impressions of Zelensky. And Raymond Bonnewell asked if Zelensky's role as a comedian, in your impression, makes him more charismatic as a leader, the ways in which you sort of felt that part of his identity in your impressions of him and in your discussion with him. So just a little bit on sort of your impressions of your meeting with Zelensky.
So first of all, the meeting happened in April, which was the moment right after the Russians had left the northern suburbs of Kiev. So the discovery of the atrocities at Bucha had just happened, some days earlier. So it was still a moment when things felt very ropey and uncertain there. And we had, I don't know that we have time for me to describe the whole journey, but it was,
sure.
There was a train, and there was the only way to get in was on the train. And at that point, there weren't any regular trains. It was a kind of special secret train that only a few people knew about. And I had the funny experience of going with my editor, Jeff Goldberg, who's editor of The Atlantic. He doesn't have a lot of free time. He really wanted to do this, though. And so, we got arranged all at the last minute. It was like we bought the tickets on Sunday morning, flew on Sunday afternoon, arrived in Warsaw, in the morning on Monday. And Jeff said to me, so, we were on the way to the train station. He said, so you have the tickets? And I said, nope, there are no tickets. And he, what? I said, what happens is we go to the platform and we say, Serhiy sent us. And then we get on the train. And he said, you're joking. And I said, no. But that was what happened. So we got on the train, we got to Kiev, and we saw Zelensky. I mean, I think the important thing about Zelensky is that he wants you to understand him as an ordinary person in an extraordinary circumstance. He's, in that sense, kind of anti-Putin. So he's not pompous. He's deliberately unpompous. When he came to see us, first of all, we didn't wait for him very long. We got there, we waited a minute or two, and then we hear him coming down the hall. And as he's walking into the room, he's kind of cursing and holding his back because his back hurts, for some reason. So he says, oh, I'm really sorry, my back hurts. I have an old back, and then he kind of looks at us and he says, hi in English. We say hi, after this, mega 3-day journey to get there. But that's both authentic and deliberate, so he is authentically a normal person who finds himself in this circumstance, but that's also the persona that he has adopted. And he's adopted it not just with us, but with everybody else. And so this method of communication that he uses, I don't know if people know, but people I met with Americans know, but he speaks every night to Ukrainians, and he does so using the cell phone on his office desk. So there's no cameras, there's no makeup, it's not like some presidential address, in the Rose Garden or the Kremlin, it's just Zelensky in his office. He's kind of dark, and he talks into his cell phone. And he's used that means of communication since the war started. Also, you will all have noticed he's wearing a green t-shirt and fatigues. Yeah. That's because that's the uniform of the Ukrainian Territorial Army. So that's the uniform of the volunteers. So it's not the uniform. He could wear, a uniform and epaulets and whatever. Right. I mean, he could dress like he's the commander in chief. He could dress like that too. And there are other recent presidents of Ukraine who I'm sure would. And he doesn't, again, for the same reason, because he intuitively understands that would be fake. I mean, obviously he's not a general, and he doesn't want to pretend to be one. And so that's sort of the key to understanding how he's running the war and how he's also running, this kind of simultaneous, I mean, it's not a publicity campaign. That's the wrong language. I mean, he's running a kind of hearts and minds campaign, both one inside Ukraine to keep Ukrainians motivated, to keep them believing in the future and keep them fighting, but also a campaign to keep Ukraine's Western supporters on side. That's why he speaks to music festivals, universities, security conferences. He'll why he's given addresses to the, to Congress and to parliaments and to the G20 recently, a couple weeks ago. All of that is to keep, is to encourage. He understands his role as the person who can build international support for Ukraine and also build some kind of domestic, esprit de corps. He's not an expert. He doesn't pretend to be. He doesn't pretend to be things that he's not. The expert of the generals, and he asks them what they think the military strategy should be. And so that's all. That's a particularly unique style of leadership, especially in that part of the world. And so far, it's worked for him pretty well. And as I said, I think it works because it's both quite carefully planned. I mean, he clearly has a large collection of green t-shirts, someone bought them. On the other hand, it's also authentic. That's really who he is. The comedian thing is interesting. We wrote a little bit about that in the article. Yeah. He wasn't a comedian in the sense of, being a guy who tells jokes. He was a satirist. Right. He did political satire. And in order to be a satirist, you have to have a pretty good idea of what people will find funny. So you have to understand politics, and you have to understand how to make fun of politics in a way that will be funny. And that's actually quite a sophisticated thing to be. So he had to think a lot about, what are popular assumptions? How do you undermine them? How do you play with them? And if you watch his famous television series, which is called Servant of the People, which is about him running for president. This is before he really ran for president. You see a lot of that in it. He's playing with the idea, kind of making fun of Ukrainians for being overly respectful of people in power. He makes fun of, the oligarchs who think they're manipulating everything. He's sort of pulling everybody's leg. And I think that actually probably did help him a lot, as president. And, again, he's not somebody who expected to be a wartime president or who wanted to be. Actually, his platform when he was running was more about trying to find common ground with Russians, trying to end the war. Remember, the war has been going on since 2014, the war in the East. And I don't think he imagined himself in this particular role. But I do think that there are ways in which the satirical background has helped him.
So we're already, of course, quickly running out of time. So let me follow this up. So when you interviewed President Zelensky in April, he said that Russians don't need just access to facts. They need help understanding their own history, what they have done to their neighbors. So I just want your impressions a little bit, since you've written books on many of the darkest chapters of Soviet history. Can you talk a bit more about how you perceive Russians' understanding of their own history? And if you think it is a meaningful distinction, maybe you can talk about whether you think there's a difference between sort of popular understanding of history and the understanding that is promoted by the Putin regime. Because, it's always struck me, of course, as a Gulag scholar, right, that it's not that they deny the dark pages of the past. Well, maybe on the Ukrainian famine, we might actually say something a little different there. But they do have a large Gulag museum in Moscow. They do have a monument to the victims of Soviet repression in Moscow. But they also always seem to want to minimize or relativize or sort of contextualize these dark spots within a narrative of national or, I don't know, maybe imperial greatness or something. Anyway, I'm just wondering, since you work on the Gulag, I'm sure that you have paid a little bit of attention to this over the years, how Russia has approached some of these things that you write about in the way that it is sort of understood in Russia today.
So it's complicated. I mean, I have trouble nowadays talking in a broad way about Russians. I haven't been there in a decade. I had to stop going for obvious reasons. And I stopped going a while ago, in fact. I have a lot of close Russian friends who I do talk to about this, but of course I imagine they're exceptions. It's hard to, in that sense, I mean, it is actually hard to generalize, because there's clearly a part of the Russian population that knows history well, that remembers it and understands it, if only through their own families and through their own family histories. But the effect of really 2 decades now of, I think maybe I should say something about Putin propaganda. It's not the kind of propaganda you get in Russia. It's very different from the old Soviet version. So Putin isn't always telling Russians, how great they are and how perfect everything is. And, we overfulfilled the plan and we have the largest harvest ever. It's not this kind of Soviet propaganda. It's almost the opposite of that. It's kind of official nihilism. Mm-hmm. The goal is to make people feel apathy, to make them feel distance. They're told a series of lies and different stories, it confuse, very, at a fast pace, very confusingly. And the idea is to get them to say, right, I don't have any idea what's happening. I don't want to know, and I'm staying out of it. And so I think the vast majority of Russians just see themselves as outside of all of these questions. They aren't part of political debate. Yeah. They don't care about history. They don't want to know about anything. They're outside of it. I mean, had there been a discussion of history in Russia, in the 90s, that was a little bit like the discussion of history you got in Germany, like in the 70s and 80s, not immediately after the war, but a bit later. Right. In which people came to understand that the terrible things that had happened because of apathy and because of the lack of civic engagement and because of dictatorship and because of empire, because of Moscow's need to impose its will on all these different kinds of places. If there had been that kind of discussion, you can imagine that Russia might be a different place by now. So it's not, you're right, it's not just a question of people acknowledging that this stuff happened. It's also, what conclusions do you draw from that? Why did it happen?
Mhm.
How did we let it happen? How can we make sure it doesn't happen again? What are the checks and balances you need in the political system or in the Constitution to make sure it doesn't happen again? How can you create a political system that that protects minorities and protects against abuse of power and respects the rule of law? I mean, none of that conversation. There was a little bit of it in the 90s, but it was really crushed in the 2000s by Putin. And so, so my general sense is that although there is a part of Russian society that does know history, there's a large part that either doesn't know or doesn't understand why it's relevant, or somehow, as I said, it's almost like there's a Chinese wall between us and everyone who's in power and everyone who talks about politics and everyone who talks about the past.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that needs to be overcome. I mean, one of my hopes is, and maybe, I know we're coming to the end, maybe it's worth saying, one of my hopes is that if Russia loses this war and really loses in a way that they understand that they have lost, maybe some of that understanding will begin to penetrate. We lost, it was a mistake, and the empire is over. And our attempt to impose our autocratic system on our neighbors was a failure, and will go on being a failure. And not only was it a failure, and not only was it so destructive of Ukraine, it was very destructive of Russia. Think what's been done to Russia and Russians because of this totally unnecessary, brutal war. I don't know that we've really understood this. Hundreds of thousands of Russians have left the country. I mean, one wave left in February, another wave left in September after the mobilization decree. I mean, this is an enormous number of probably the best educated, the most active people who now live in Kazakhstan or Armenia or Georgia or maybe Europe. Some live in Europe, and that's a huge vote of negative vote for the country.
Right,
I mean,
right.
The downside is those are of course also the people who would constitute some kind of alternate elite or some kind of alternate, I don't know, some kind of alternate political society if they were there. But who knows? Maybe in the next months or years they'll create something like that outside of the country.
So I mean, I've said repeatedly to friends and talking to them that like Russia needs to lose the war for Russia.
Yes,
like, that's the only way forward for Russia. So you wrote a really interesting piece arguing precisely that the only way that the war really comes to an end is for Putin to lose. And a couple of my students asked questions about this. And of course, it in part asked you to think toward the future a little bit instead of the past, but let me ask anyway. And I'll put it the way that Zach Sane, one of my students, did. He said, how can Russia lose in a way that they are humiliated enough to end the war for good, but not so much that they feel like a cornered animal and use nuclear weapons or something like this to ensure their victory? Do you have a comment on that? I know it's a hard question to really address, but
no, I wrote another piece about nuclear weapons, which wasn't too long that you could also share.
Okay.
Essentially, it's not something that we control. My instinct is that they won't use them because Putin is a rational actor. What he's doing is not irrational or illogical. And the use of nuclear weapons would immediately have reverberations both internationally and domestically. I mean, it would create enormous antagonism with China, with Russia's other neighbors, with Kazakhstan, with other countries in the region. It could incur a backlash inside Russia. It would be a break with precedent in a way that I don't see how it helps Putin. I also don't see how it helps him win the war. It might have the opposite effect. And so my guess is that he won't do that, and that and in fact the opposite is the case, which is that his constant threat of doing it, and they talk about it all the time, and they do it for a reason. I think is hampering our ability to help the Ukrainians win. I mean, we've put these kind of, we've put our own caps on what we'll do for them and how we'll help them. We won't give them the longest range, ammunition, and we won't give them, the modern tanks. And all that is because, because we're worried those will be some kind of provocation. And and that's, so in a way, he's deterred us. So how come he's deterred us and we don't have any confidence that we're able to deter him? I'm not sure I understand it. And, it's also an odd thing, the Ukrainians themselves aren't scared and they would be the victims. So we're not going to be the victims of this use of nuclear weapons in Eastern Ukraine. So it seems to me very unlikely. I mean, there's another danger around the conversation about nuclear weapons that I worry about, which is that, we're so focused on the use of nuclear weapons that we don't think about the other horrible things that are happening. I mean, frankly, taking out the Ukrainian, all the power stations is pretty horrific.
Absolutely.
And it could mean that thousands of people die, people in hospitals and elderly people and so on. And everybody's, oh, well, at least it's not nuclear weapons. I mean, that's insane.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why we aren't thinking about what's the correct response to that escalation. Why don't we don't seem to have a way of responding to it. And I think that's that's also wrong. But these are, there isn't really a right or wrong on this, because at the end of the day, it's all in Putin's head and we can't read his mind.
Right. So let me ask you one last question because we're running out of time. And let me ask you this, and I'm going to return to that historical essay from February that I started with. It ends like this. You write, "The clash that is coming will matter to all of us in ways that we can't yet fathom. In the centuries-long struggle between autocracy and democracy, between dictatorship and freedom, Ukraine is now the front line, and our front line too." So I was wondering, to conclude today, can you talk a bit about how you see this war in the context of what I've seen as your many years of writing in opposition to the rise of authoritarianism in both the United States and in Europe? And so I was just wondering if you comment a little bit on how you ended that essay, which I found quite poignant.
So this is the place where Russia decided to test the limits of the West. Were we willing to defend a democracy on Europe's borders? And it does matter that it's in Europe. So it does matter that it's, that we're talking about a continent where the US has, many decades long involvement, where US troops were based during the Cold War, still are based, where we, we've had a policy going back, to the Second World War and of defending whatever is the border of the outer border of democracy. And the Russians decided to test it there. And other autocracies around the world were also watching carefully that test. What would happen? Would the West, having invested so much in Ukraine, having invested in Ukrainian reforms, having involved itself in helping Ukraine begin to rebuild its army in 2014, would we really come to their defense? And the fact that we did has, I think, already been very important. Whatever happens next. I happen to have been a few weeks ago in Taiwan. Taiwan, a country nothing to do with Ukraine historically, culturally, or any other way. Taiwanese are nevertheless obsessed with Ukraine, and they understand exactly what is the analogy. If a big, large autocracy can invade a small democracy and is allowed to get away with it in one place, then maybe there will be, another invasion in another place. So you can see how this could be seen all over the world. I would also say, and this is, by the way, this is completely unprovable. And to be clear, this is not based on facts or history or anything. I intuitively, I can't help but wonder whether the protests that we've seen in Iran, amazing protests over the last weeks, and the protests that have just started in China, in which people are not only protesting these COVID lockdowns, they're also talking about the Communist Party, about freedom of speech, and so on. I can't help wonder whether some of it isn't inspired by the bravery of people in Ukraine. I mean, I can't prove it. I don't have any evidence for it. I do know that in both Iran and China, as in Russia, there are people who can read the true history of the war. People have VPNs. They can get through the Chinese firewall or through the Iranian censorship. I do know that the story, is available and can be read at least by some people, if not by everybody. And I can't help but wonder if it's not inspirational. It's certainly going to be inspirational to people in the future, and people will look back on this as a really historic example of brave resistance, and it will be remembered for a long time. And I think it will already, even no matter how it ends, it will already play an important historical role in the minds of people who are thinking about should they fight for some kind of freedom, and whether they're Taiwanese or whether they're from somewhere else. I think they'll see this as a model.
One of the fascinating things this semester about teaching this course entirely online is that I actually have a student who's been taking the class from China. And so it's been interesting to talk to him about how the Chinese media covers all this. And anyway, I mean, no time to get into it now, but it's really been, this kind of interesting thing that you can do in the online teaching space. Well, Anne, thank you so much for coming and for answering all these questions. I have at least a dozen more that we didn't have time to get to, but that's the way it always goes. But I thought it was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it. And I thought it was a great way for us to end our series.
Thank you so much. Your students are so lucky to have you. What a great idea and what a great way to run a course.
I appreciate that. I certainly urge everybody to read Anne's books. We've given you links for how to find more information about them, to read her writing for The Atlantic. You will undoubtedly learn a tremendous amount out of all of that. But let me thank you all for just coming and joining us. So many of you were here week after week through 12 consecutive weeks of some of the most amazing scholars you will find, who all shared their ideas, I would say both emotionally and honestly. Your presence here has meant the world to me. The many emails I've received from people over the course of the semester that just tell me how much they've enjoyed this has really made all of the work worthwhile. But your presence here, I think, also reflects your commitment to continuing the conversation, to refusing to allow the subject of Russia's war in Ukraine to slip to the back pages of our newspapers or to slip to the recesses of our minds. We have to continue to support Ukraine. They have to win, not only for Ukraine's sake, but for all of our sakes. And as we said just a bit ago, also honestly for Russia's sake as well. A better Russia can only come through defeat in this war. As a reminder, please join us tomorrow at 3 p.m. for art historian Svetlana Shields with Can Ukrainian Art Explain Why Russia Launched the War Against Ukraine? And join Cynthia Hooper and I on Friday for our weekly Q&A session. And finally, please keep an eye out for messages from me about events to come next semester as we try to keep the conversation going. If I don't see you before then, my best wishes to all of you in whatever holidays you'll be celebrating in the next month. And may the new year bring joy and peace to all of you, and may it most importantly bring victory and peace to Ukraine. Thanks, everybody, and take care.